Not yet.
No, I'm holding it until you say. Okay. Yeah.
Design that I've made.
Hi everyone. Welcome to this session. This is the final session of the conference in the Justice Strand. The Justice Strand is a collaboration between Solidarity Across Land Trades, SALT, Seeding Reparations and Shared Assets. And this session is Rooting for Diversity, and it's about neurodiversity in farming. The Justice Strand is centred on equity, solidarity and collaboration. Some of the topics that we're covering are difficult. Please practice the ethos of justice and care in the space and be considerate of others. And if you do need to access wellbeing support, you can speak to our volunteer at the back. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jim Aplin. I'm a grower for the past 20 years. That's what I do for a living. I've chosen to be a director of the Organic Growers Alliance, and I'm autistic because I was born this way, and I've got no complaints about that. This session came about because neurodiversity and neurodivergence has been from time to time brought up at this conference and other places, but it seemed to me it was always being brought up as a care farm issue. And this isn't a word of criticism of the care farms. They do an excellent job, but it's an issue for farming in general. It's a general workplace, employers and employees in farming and other land work. And it is particularly getting more notice now that we have a very high rate of neurodivergence in farming and land work. There's obvious reasons, can be people attracted to get away from the cities and the crowds, or there's people in traditional family farms who've actually standing up, haven't been pushed out by gentrification and the sort of industrialisation of the countryside, because they really want to hold on to what they do and they're attached to it. The working with animals, apart from people, instead of people, can be a real appeal for some. And I think there's also an element, especially in rural areas, that a mixture of how farming and land work sort of are what you end up doing if you're not good for anything else, and it's sort of denigrated. At the same time, schools where the talents of neurodivergent children are missed and they're dismissed. They said, oh, get into farming and forestry. And that's the way it goes. We did talk with other people over the last couple of years about the possibility of putting on a session that addressed it as a workplace issue, but for a bit I think nobody was making the first move. But when I was supported by the Organic Growers Alliance, I put a word out, if any other neurodivergent land workers interested in putting this session on, straight away there was a real uptake when the LWA circulated amongst their members, and found out from Karen at the Soil Association that she was looking for a proposal for the same session. So it sort of came together at high speed and quite creatively, and at the last minute before the deadline, which probably isn't all that surprising, given the whole session's been put together by neurodivergent land workers. We wanted to keep it that way, without involving others, not for exclusivity, but partly to show that we are capable of doing things, that the different talents of very varied neurodivergent people can complement each other. A quick word, so please bear in mind that all of us on this panel are actually talking about issues that are very personal to us, and in some cases discussing this publicly for the first time. And as we've got problems with sort of social interactions anyway, may find it very awkward. So if a panellist gets up and leaves, don't worry about it. They're just doing what they need to do. If any, I'll be fidgeting away, or any sort of things like that, people stimming, or who just move about a bit. You know, that's normal, that's acceptable, that's fine. And equally for anybody who's here, that if you feel the need to move about or not comfortable or stimming, noise cancelling headphones, however you feel comfortable, that's okay. We realised from an early stage that we're actually trying to aim a conversation in two very different directions. One is to allow neurodivergent landworkers to actually raise their voices and talk about their problems, find sort of commonalities, that type of issues we're facing, but also to open up a conversation with wider farming. So for a greater understanding amongst farming organisations and farms, so they can benefit as well as us by allowing the talents of the neurodivergent to be properly used. So we're happier, more comfortable, more rewarding, and farms can themselves be more productive. We wondered whether that was right, but thought, no, that's the way it's got to be, and hope it doesn't occasionally get clunky. And as part of this conversation, Richard soon will be talking about some of the terms and the ideas around neurodivergence. Don't worry if you use the wrong words. There aren't wrong words to use. None of us will be expressing any prejudice or adversarial approach to each other, so nobody's going to take offence if they thought, oh, a different, more exact word could have been used. And just set the context, I'd like to stress that neurodiversity is a natural, evolved part of biodiversity, of human biodiversity. It's not, neurodivergence is not some affliction that needs a cure, that should be treated as a disease. It's evolved, it's part of what humanity is. For example, autism has a fairly complex pattern of inheritance. The last research I looked at, around 30 genes were implicated, and numerous gene regulatory sequences, and none of these genes is present in all cases of autism either. And they're also only expressed as our brain develops and takes shape in response to the environment. But although it's complex, one thing that has emerged is that it's highly conserved by natural selection. And if it was a huge disadvantage, natural selection would be working to remove autism from the population. And the genes that are involved, some of them go back to very basic divergence of humanity from chimpanzees, the fundamental to what actually makes us human. And a number of the mutations that are important have been dated by the sort of molecular clock to have emerged in the times of the last ice ages or glacial maximums, which for humanity at the time was facing challenges of rapidly changing climate, how to find different ways of food. And the most obvious explanation is that autism emerged actually as an advantage to humanity, increasing chances of survival for populations with different ways of thinking. It's sometimes lightly put as, while most cavemen were sat in the cave and inventing language round a fire, there was a little autistic kid was playing outside and inventing the wheel. And that may not have anything to do with how things happened in reality, but it's a bit of an indication of that the different talents were needed at the time. I know ADHD has also in research been shown to include traits that are positively beneficial to foraging communities. So all these different neurodivergent conditions that can have a cost for individuals, can make it really difficult with sensory issues and social issues. They're here because they're advantageous to humanity. And part of the task here and the conversations we're trying to start is to how make sure that after we've been living in all this industrialised system that's been all these uniform shaped holes, that's been hammering pegs of different shapes into it at big cost to some people, to actually find out how we can accommodate and make the most of neurodivergence to all our benefits. We'll be going over to Richard for an introduction in a minute, but before our panel discussion. I've got a few questions for them anyway, and then an open question and answers. But first, Ez is going to give us a guided pause and settle to make everybody feel at ease before the session.
Hi everyone, so is the sound working okay? Yeah. Yeah, I just felt when we were planning this that, as a neurodiverse person, I know that sometimes it can be hard to stay embodied for a long time, but also to stay regulated, especially if content is like new or maybe, quite activating. So I thought to offer some kind of settling, but when I'm here now, I had the thought that maybe if it felt comfortable, we could even do a little bit like less just sitting here kind of like this, but if people felt we could just, the invitation is to maybe stand and to be able to kind of stretch out a little bit because we've been sitting for 2 days basically. So just letting your body, if you look wherever feels comfortable, you don't have to be looking into the eyes of the person next to you, and just like letting yourself stretch out, feeling your feet on the ground and your sense of like your body in this space, and like you exist here and you're welcome here just as you are, just as you find yourself right now, and however you identify in this context of neurodivergence, you're really welcome here. So just, stretching, and maybe we can, even though it's a bit more edgy, we can take a big in-breath, and on the exhale, just making a bit of a sound to release any tension from the days. And again. And one more for good luck. That's about it. So I'll hand over to Richard.
Hello, yes, I'm Richard Lewis. So I'm kind of feeling a bit of imposter syndrome because I'm not an expert, but I have been neurodivergent all my life, although I've not always known that. So my first diagnosis was when I was 12, but it was post-traumatic stress disorder. And I didn't have a diagnosis of autism until I was 29, and it was quite difficult to get that diagnosis after first going through the steps of working it out myself. And then more recently, just in the previous year, I've also realised that actually I have ADHD alongside the autism. So, and I still have complex PTSD as it's now diagnosed. So it's been quite a process of scraping back the layers to understand what's going on, and finding out through that process, learning about different aspects of neurodiversity. And a lot of that has come from literature from within the neurodiverse community. There's a lot of autistic and ADHD writers and content creators out there that have really helped shape the narrative and really be at the forefront of learning. I just wanted to start out by introducing a few of the key terms and ideas that some of us will be familiar with, and they might be new to some people. We've not got time to go into everything in depth, but I'm sure some of them we'll come back to in the rest of the conversation, so don't worry if it feels like I'm skimming over things and you've not quite got the hang of it. So I've just got 3 slides. The first one is just introducing some of the terms. So the term neurodiversity is the one that you're perhaps most likely to have heard of, and that just describes the full range of diversity of the ways in which human brains work. So that includes what we term neurotypical, which is the term given to people whose brain function allows them to function easily in society. Another term for that that's come about more recently is neuroconforming. And then another word that's often used is neurodivergence. And this is usually used to refer to a group of neurodevelopmental conditions which are sort of lifelong differences in understanding the world and responding to the world. There are different ways in which our brains are hardwired. They're very diverse and sometimes contradictory. Some of the most common examples are autism and ADHD. That's where there's sort of a lot more activism and research and action, but also dyslexia, Tourette's, obsessive-compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, and more recently there's been the termed AUDHD, AUDHD, which is where people like me who have both ADHD and autism, there's a unique way that they interact, and that's really come through from the community. So there's a lot of diversity within any one of those diagnoses. So any one autistic person might have a very different experience or set of needs to another autistic person. And obviously there's a lot of difference between people with different diagnoses. Some of the commonalities are often sensory sensitivities, so different ways of responding to visual stimuli or other sense stimuli. There's differences in communication styles, and also often differences in social interaction. There's also often a wide range of other positive attributes and characteristics that come with it that are equally varied and diverse and unique to each individual. Sort of talking about neurotypical people, one of the reasons that I've only just recently come across the term neuroconforming is hinting at the fact that what is neurotypical varies from culture to culture. So I've long known that as someone who's autistic, my style of communication is much more blunt and direct. And British people often find that quite difficult to manage, but a lot of my Dutch friends don't, because there's just a cultural difference. And also my background is working as a botanist. I trained in taxonomy and worked in herbaria, and most people there are probably somewhere on the spectrum. So it was much easier and much more normal, rather than working in a different, more sort of public-facing environment. So just being aware that it isn't a very clear distinction, and there is a lot of social function here. And then other categories that we might think of in terms of the very broad concept of neurodiversity are mental health issues, so anxiety, depression, PTSD, a whole wide range of things. These are typically things that, psychological disorders that one can develop, and often one can recover from through therapy or medication. So it's different to neurodevelopmental conditions, which are just a lifelong hardwiring difference. And then there are a couple of other categories of acquired brain injury. So people who have traumatic brain injury, their brains will function in different ways. And people with a general intellectual disability. So that's a disability that affects a broad range of intellectual functioning. Now those are usually sort of classified separately. Most sort of, when we talk about neurodivergence and neurodiversity, we're often just focusing on these neurodevelopmental conditions. But under certain circumstances, some researchers, some activists will start to include this whole wide range of other conditions as well. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're really just focusing on the neurodevelopmental conditions. Hang on, let me get up to speed. So I just want to go through, some of you might be familiar with the social model of disability. So the traditional way of understanding... No, it's fine, yeah. Is the mental model, so these are treated as medical problems. So the diagnosis was performed by medical professionals, and the diagnosis was made as deficits compared to what was considered a normal neurotypical brain functioning. Often some of the benefits that come with a neurodivergent condition were also seen as symptoms. So savant syndrome in some autistic people, or hyperfocus in ADHD, these are classified as symptoms and problematized when they can be great gifts. And this sort of leads to neurodivergence only being seen as a disorder and a problem. And more recently, through the disability activism, they've developed the social model of disability, of which a lot of neurodiversity activism is a part. And that really looks at all of the differences as being part of a normal part of human diversity. And it's looking at the fact that these different ways our brains function include a mix of impairment, so challenges that we face, as well as benefits. And looking at the fact that disability occurs in social environments. So there are ways that society can be structured that make me less disabled, but in those environments, and there are ways that society can be structured that make me more disabled in those environments. So the classic example is the wheelchair ramps. Like if there isn't a wheelchair ramp, someone using a wheelchair can't get into a building. But if society decides that all buildings should have ramp access, then that person doesn't have that disability of not being able to get into the building. And this led to the divergence of neurodivergence as a social and political identity. So there's a lot of activism and community now looking at how our identity as a minority, along the side disability activism and other forms of identity activism, how we can help to shape a world that's better designed for us to be part of. So just a very brief sort of overview of how we've got to this point. This is still a very new idea. So the terms neurodivergence and neurodiversity didn't exist until the 1990s. And it's gone through a lot of hoops since then. There's been it started with a greater medical understanding, particularly of autism, and the inclusion of Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis in the English literature in the 90s, just after I would have been diagnosed, so I just kind of missed out on that as a child. And that's led to the development of communities of people who are discussing this amongst ourselves, particularly as autistic and ADHD adults and young people, understanding our role and having that ability to reach out to others. And the development of the internet was really significant in people from very diverse communities and very diverse places being able to share experiences and realise similarities and understand ways of advocating for themselves, making a difference and making a better space. And this was sort of alongside the ongoing development of the disability rights movement, but there's also diversity within neurodivergent thought and activism. So there's, for example, the use of language to identify oneself. Some people use person-first identity, such as a person with autism. This is now more common amongst the groups, parents groups who are fighting for rights for their children to get the support they need in school. Whereas often neurodivergent adults will describe themselves using identity-first language. So I would describe myself as an autistic person. And then there's sort of another sort of intersection with the disability rights movement and the people with physical disabilities, and how the movement for inclusion has overlaps but also differences in terms of neurodevelopmental conditions versus the needs of people with physical disabilities. And also it's really important to understand that there's a lot of intersectionality within the neurodivergent communities. There's a big overlap with queer identities, a wide range of queer identities. And there's also a lot of overlap with mental health diagnoses as well. And this can, as with me, it can present challenges in gaining a diagnosis. So a lot of the diagnostic systems are set up for children, and now they're pretty good. But when I was growing up, they weren't. They didn't have the same understanding. So there are a lot of autistic and ADHD adults out there who never got a diagnosis. And some people it's really challenging. Like for me, the hoops I would have to go through to get an ADHD diagnosis as an adult, I had to weigh up whether it's worth it or not. For autism, it was worth it. It was very difficult, but it was worth it because it meant I got support for the university course I was doing at the time. But otherwise, I might not have gone for it. And also, it presents very differently. It can present very differently in different groups. So particularly, women have historically been, or people who are assigned female at birth have been underdiagnosed with most of these conditions. And it can present very differently. And lots of doctors have historically seen some of these conditions as typically male. And also in people who are racialized as black or as being people of color, it can present differently and it can be misdiagnosed. There's a lot of misdiagnosis and difficulty in accessing diagnosis for people who are racialized. Yeah, and just ending on the note that the spectrum of neurodiversity includes a wide range of neurotypical identities as well. So just as we're talking about our differences of experience, there's a very wide range of neurotypical experiences as well, which tend to get sort of glossed over. And, my experience is I work alongside three people who would identify as neurotypical, but they have a range of different gifts and needs, and having a workplace that is open to discussing and identifying these has been beneficial for all of us, not just me as a neurodivergent person. And that's it for now, I think.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was really clear and useful. I think two of us have both introduced ourselves, so would the rest of the panel like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi all, I'm very excited to be here because this combines my two special interests, which one is obviously like sustainable food systems. I work for the Soil Association as a farming advisor, but also I'm diagnosed as neurodivergent, and I've gone down a rabbit hole the last few years of actually studying that as well and becoming a qualified neurodivergent coach. I only got diagnosed at age 39. I think like a lot of people, I had this very stereotypical view so it started with ADHD, my first diagnosis. I had this stereotypical view, it was just very hyperactive children in school. I had absolutely no idea how ADHD presented in females. It was only in lockdown when I thought, I'm going to download TikTok, see what it's about, that it started showing me some videos of ADHD women and some of the traits, and I was like, that resonates. That really resonates. So I went down a bit of a research rabbit hole and was like, I tick so many boxes. So I did. I went for an assessment and got diagnosed, and I scored very highly on it for everything. And it was just the kind of that kind of opening of just this self-awareness of, I think I might have dyscalculia as well, which is a very common co-occurrence, dyslexia. or didn't understand in lockdown why I couldn't hear anybody. And it turns out because audio processing disorder is also a big co-occurrence. So you can actually hear okay. It's how your brain processes that information. So things like subtitles on TV really help. And then, yeah, again, it's just like kind of further rabbit hole of why, like, my cycle, so like my hormonal cycle, why it impacted me so much. And I found out about something called PMDD. And it's a massive, like, say, as a woman, autistic or neurodivergent, the interplay between like the dopamine and different brain chemicals with the hormones such as estrogen and progesterone, we have a much like rougher time kind of and variance within that cycle. I also I've got fibromyalgia and digestive issues, and again, it's just finding out that there's such a Venn chart of those things. So I kind of was resistant to medication, but I eventually got medicated, and actually I'm on a very low dose, but it does just help me stay focused on things. One of the reasons I trained to be a coach is because I also had coaching, and it did teach me some kind of like coping strategies at work. But I think the most important thing I've learned, say, I'm 43 now, so still relatively not that long, is self-compassion. I just understand how my brain works. I know where my strengths are. I know where I struggle. But it's that self-compassion of just understanding myself, and also things like rejection sensitivity dysphoria is common with neurodivergence. So we kind of feel rejection a lot stronger, and it's just having that awareness and things in place to help understand that. The more I'm looking into it, the more I'm like, oh, I have got some autism traits as well. But when I did my course, like Professor on that said, like there's only so much space in our brain, so like often there is a lot of overlap with everything. But yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of having this conversation.
Thank you, Karen. Hi everyone, I'm Ez. I go by they, them, ideally my name. So yeah, I guess in terms of land work, my background has been kind of with lots of kind of local community projects, small market gardens, and yeah, about 5 years ago, moving to Devon, I really found that love for land work. And in terms of my neurodivergence, I only got a diagnosis for ADHD about 1.5 years ago. And similarly to Karen, it was partly through social media, but before that, I turned around to a friend who has ADHD, and like in the kitchen, and I was just like, do you think that I show some ADHD? And I hadn't even finished the sentence. They were like, duh. And that moment was like, oh. And so then I went down a rabbit hole online, and I was like, wow, there's a lot there that feels, like it speaks to me. And then I got, I was lucky enough to be able to get a private diagnosis, and the waiting list for like NHS diagnosis was like 2 years or more. So I'm just so aware of the difference in privilege for that capacity to be able to get that diagnosis. And for me, again, similar to Karen, I really found, like, surprisingly, the avenue of self-compassion that came through that diagnosis, because with that knowledge came this kind of opportunity to just soften around all the things I kind of had this secret shame about, like, oh, the fact that I'm always late, and just these endless lists of like things I just thought were specifically me, and I just really was so mean on myself. But just to be like, yes, I can try and work on them, and like my brain works differently. There's different chemicals pumping through, and yeah, I don't know, that gives me an opportunity to just be kinder to myself, and I appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to unpacking during this panel. Thank you.
I'm Jo. I go by she, her pronouns. Struggling with imposter syndrome over here, which I'm sure we all deal with a little bit. Where to start? I am a land worker. I'm an agroecological grower based at a CSA in Bristol. But before that, I used to work in television. So I think I masked a lot of my neurodivergent symptoms through just being totally overwhelmed by TV and getting burnt out and not really paying attention to me. I was just a vessel for the work. And then actually the transition out of desk-based work and into land work was like completely intermeshed with my ADHD diagnosis. I went to a festival and went to a talk that I thought was about like a woman coming out of midwifery and into land work, and it turned out to be this massive journey about her talking about her ADHD diagnosis, and I was just sitting there crying because it was the first time that I'd ever heard anything that sounded like my experience, and that's sort of what led me on a long, wiggly route to diagnosis. Again, I was on a waiting list for like 3 years, and impulsively decided to just book an appointment and just get to the bottom of it. So yeah, I got an official diagnosis in 2022, and I still struggle all the time with like cycles of burnout and not knowing how to rest. But I think a beautiful thing here is that we're part of the justice strand, and for me, like a massive calling of this work is so like justice orientated, and it's what drives me. And I think that's kind of one of the superpowers of my neurodivergence. But yeah, really looking forward to talking more about like land work specifically and how that crosses over. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. If there's a few questions to the panel that awkwardly I forgot to write them out for myself. So, firstly, if you could all consider and let us know what qualities and talents that you think is your neurodivergent attributes bring to land work. It's a bit of an awkward question because how do any of us know exactly what our neurodivergence is helping us? Because we're all people. It's not something separate. If I wasn't autistic, I wouldn't be me. So I'd find it a difficult question to answer and can only think of one particular thing. It's not my bread and butter work, but tree pruning that I do a lot of, especially of fruit trees over the winter. That's not to do with thinking of I'm supposed to do this, supposed to do that. It's very much seeing the patterns in the trees and the process over time, which makes me probably the worst tutor out for anybody who's trying to learn tree pruning, although I can get really good results myself. But I don't know if anybody would like to answer this first, or what their talents.
I think one of the first things about kind of working out in nature is that kind of like this neuro-mirroring. So we're in nature, like kind of like that, it comes on that kind of like forest bathing and things that a lot of the time say neurodivergence, it is in our nervous system. So we get quite easily dysregulated, our nervous system, and like adrenaline is just a bit more kind of pumped up to another level. So I find that kind of like when you're out in nature, be it kind of like I've done kind of like biodiversity assessments, soil sampling, soil assessments, it's just being able to kind of focus on that and just feel calmer. I'd also say it's that kind of like justice, we have this like injustice sensitivity where we just like, we have strong passions. And I find, and I do say anecdotally, like I meet a lot of neurodivergent people out on farm that I work with, and we just all have this kind of like strong passion to protect the environment, to make a difference, and to change systems. And I think that's kind of one of the biggest things in neurodivergence is that you just don't accept things as they are. You kind of like, why? Question everything. So yeah, I would say those are, I've got quite a big list here, but that's two of, I would say, my strengths.
I guess, yeah, like hyper-focus is a superpower. Like, if you need me to pick salad for 3 hours, that's fine. If I'm in the right flow, then that's going to be a dream for me. And the systems change thing, like in land work, I guess it's to compensate for potential overwhelm because there are so many jobs that need doing and various priorities on the land. But if there's a system that I might have helped build, like some kind of board system where we can move things physically of like, this is to do, this is doing, and this is done. Like I like bringing those systems with me to support myself in no overwhelm, but I hope it also supports the team that I work with in their systems as well.
Yeah, appreciating those points. I probably would say those too and add to them in a moment. But I guess also for me, there's something that I witness in neurodivergence. Maybe, like I can only really speak for ADHD from my own lived experience, but that kind of creative, imaginative, problem-solving capacity, I think is really rich. And with that, this kind of this yearning for systems change, I think is, I was having a conversation with some friends that also are neurodivergent, and this friend has autism, and we were talking about like how there's almost this quality of like your sense of inner integrity and your values, when they're not being met, it almost physically, it's almost like part of the neurodivergence that it starts to get to such a point that it's physically almost like a sensory, it becomes almost like a sensory overload where you're like, I can't stay in this job anymore, to such an extent that you can't mask it, you can't, and suddenly you're saying to someone, this is unacceptable and don't you see this, in a way that maybe other people might be able to put a lid on for longer, or, and that can be a challenge and a gift. So, yeah.
So, yeah, a couple of the things on my list echo that. So, looking at planning and problem solving. So, for me, it's sort of this intersection of a creativity of being able to imagine new ways of doing things, new ideas, new projects, combined with the ability to analyse those strategically and think, plan them through. What will work, what won't work. If it is going to work, how does it need to be? Identifying where there may be inefficiencies in the systems or barriers to things. So I think there's sort of that way of just seeing systems and projects differently. But the other one I really wanted to say, which is potentially controversial, is empathy. So one of the core diagnostic criteria for autism used to be a lack of empathy, which is defined clinically in a very specific way, but is extremely problematic and has I could go on to the politics of it for a long time. But more recent research has shown that there's actually what's called a double empathy problem, I think it's called, in that as neurodivergent people, we have a lot of empathy with each other because we understand the communication. And neurotypical people are good at having empathy with other neurotypical people. But it's bridging that divide that can be difficult. And so neurotypical people struggle to be empathetic with neurodivergent people and vice versa. But my experience is that autistic people in particular, neurodivergent people, there's a lot of empathy for the well-being of the people around us and the world around us. As you were saying, this sort of strong social justice thread, I think, comes from a really profound sense of empathy. And also this ability to care about the well-being of the people we work with and think about that as a meaningful, important part of our work.
Oh, thank you. I was learning quite a bit of that myself, and also a slight surprise because, again, it's easy to see caricatures of or stereotypes of different neurodivergences, partly because of the media, culture or whatever. And I quite often see autism and ADHD as very different and complementary. But when Joe said about picking the salads, hyper-focus, because I always think of ADHD as much more creative, while autistic me is going to focus on the detail. And I did a number of seasonal horticultural jobs mainly before I became a grower for myself. And I thought, oh, that's really autistic, that I just enjoyed the apple all day and getting into it and earning good money, or the cherries or whatever, and then think, oh, what I think is a very different neurodivergent in one way, often finding the same from being on the same job. And that's definitely one advantage that can be brought to. There are a lot of land jobs that does mean doing the same thing again and again for a protracted period of time, and keeping your speed up and getting it right. It's helps put the, bring the money in at the end of the day, to be honest.
Can I just add to that? And also it's keeping the same level of attention to detail, you know, when you've been picking apples for 3 hours, as you had at the start, I think is for me, that experience is like, many people, their brains will start to switch off, but I think for me, that there's still that same presence and attention.
It's actually on this, for further information on this, the Farmers Weekly survey that came in last week has got a number of different farmers and farm managers actually answering why they think their farming benefits from what they bring to it. And it's well worth a quick read, that.
Jim, can I add one more point quickly? Yeah. I just thought of a kind of specific example, I think. I really feel that in my brain there's definitely a capacity for thinking outside the box. And like it just happens that way, in a way that I see the box and then I'm like, have you thought about this, and this, and this? And like that's what I enjoy more than the this. But I guess the positive really of that, actually in a wider context and in farming and regen ag, is like we have a rapidly changing climate that is needing innovation and flexibility, and there's such a gift in people being able to think outside the box for that. So just wanted to share that. Yeah.
And yeah, I just also wanted to add the National Autistic Society has done quite a bit of research, because there's very high levels of unemployment within the autistic community, and their research found that there was a lot of trouble at the interview stage, but that once employers employed someone who identifies as autistic, they were above averagely punctual and committed and reliable, and that actually they performed better than non-autistic candidates in many roles.
It's also, I know it's came out from the National Autistic Society, a very high degree of loyalty to employers, which actually is quite often a discussion point at the moment, turnover of farm staff and difficulty of recruiting. You get an autistic worker who enjoys working there, your likelihood of retaining that worker is huge compared to...
We don't like change.
No, keep it the same. Never change. So move on to that. And yeah, another awkward question really for everyone. But what are the challenges and obstacles that neurodivergent people face in land work? And that is a real starting point of getting into it. The interview process. Part of the reason I ended up in farming wasn't actually an attraction, it was just, I was very marginalised, moving around the countryside, and it's the work I could get without an interview. That get in contact, you need somebody, get a start, do my best and get kept on. And I can't think of any work I've ever got through interview in my life, and I've hit 60 now, and probably when I was diagnosed autistic in my early 50s, I do think of that as the first interview I passed in my life. It really isn't a good process for neurodivergence, but...
This is a bit of a random one, but there's a lot more occurrence of allergies in neurodivergent people. So yeah, I've been working in farming in various roles for over like 20 years now, and I'm allergic to hay, pollen, dust and cows. So as you can imagine, on some on-farm jobs, that is like a lambing time has actually caused some issues like milking. So yeah, just personally, that's just one that I think people just don't think about, but we're just more sensitive in all ways, including like our immune system and our histamine response. The other I would say is, especially with the ADHD side, we have a very interest-driven brain. So to engage us, it either needs to be like interest us or be novel. and those two things. So obviously when it comes to things like farm paperwork or any admin, like I know it's hard for anybody that finds it boring, but literally it's physically painful to like try and like, it takes me probably 3 times as long. And like I sometimes do things at like 10 o'clock at night because my brain on boring things just works better. But so it is that kind of, like people say you have to eat the frog and just do the boring stuff, but I do think it's, yeah, so that's another one. Obviously like the things that vary so much in farming, so many different jobs that you can do is good. But yeah, sometimes the kind of boring jobs just, yeah, take a lot of effort.
So on that issue, I find that there's like competing parts of my, which I now recognise as diagnoses, that there's part of me that wants to run away from those tasks, but there's also an autistic part of me that loves a spreadsheet and will sit happily working it out for hours. So it's like maybe finding the right diversity of people within your organisation and assigning the jobs to as appropriate.
Yeah, so I've got Cordelia in the room, who works as like project coordinator on quite a few of my projects, and like she's my executive function a lot of the time.
Challenges. Yeah, Ez and I were just talking about how, yeah, you were saying, Richard, that you don't like change. Like, I thrive in change, and I think that's what I actually struggle with land work is, until now, I've moved from place to place basically like seasonally, and I've quite enjoyed being at a different farm every season for like 5 years. And this is the first place that I'm like, okay, I've got basically a permanent contract, which is amazing to have that stability, but there's something like quite repulsive about that stability as well, which I really actually do need. I need that. So I think it's quite a challenge to be like, wow, okay, I'm here for the long haul now. How do I make it novel and interesting, but within the structure and the site that I'm on now?
I think sort of on that, I'm sort of somewhere in between, that my husband actually noticed this pattern that I get really into something and really enjoy the problem-solving aspect of setting up a new project, and I'll be really enthusiastic for like 2-3 years, and then I'll lose all interest in it. And what I'm doing at the moment, because I'm like now hitting the 5-year mark in the tree nursery I run, is I've actually brought other people on board who I'm working with, and I've kind of downloaded a lot of the information and the knowledge to them. And actually this winter, because I've been really ill, they've been just managing it with very little input from me. And then next year I'm going to get back on board because we've got a lot of changes that need to be dealt with and a lot of problems to be solved. So I know that I'll join in there and be able to like really engage with that problem solving. But now it's got to that sort of period of 4 years and all the problems are solved. I'm sort of I notice that I don't tune out, but finding a way to make that work by working in community with other people and finding those niches. I was also wanted to say, I think there's like two groups of challenges. One is in terms of understanding myself. So like the long process I've been through to understand my differing and overlapping diagnoses and understanding where some of my experiences, I've historically put down to one thing, but I now understand in a different context. And that can really transform how I manage them and how I look after myself and how I know what to ask from other people. And part of that is, I think sort of there's a lot of self-confidence and self-esteem issues. If we've grown up without a diagnosis, we've often spent our childhoods being told we're lazy or we're not trying hard enough or we're stupid for not understanding things that other people find easy. And that can really be a challenge, like a really major block later on in life to start to unpick that. And then understand ourselves, first of all, outside of that sort of conditioning, and then know what we need to ask for. And the other is like then, once we know what we need to ask for, like how do we negotiate that? How do we work within the working environment? How do we deal with people? So, it's something that, I've faced in a number of different workplaces is bullying. And it's really, rejection-sensitive dysphoria. I'm really, sensitive to it. So it's really, really challenging, but also like learning to have the self-esteem to know that I shouldn't put up with that because, you know, I've put up with that all my life because I wasn't diagnosed, so people did call me lazy and ignorant. So I think there's that sort of working out what we need for ourselves and then creating a community and an environment where those needs are met.
Just wondered if anybody has, because of the sensory issues, that the amount of machinery, because I think it's quite a complex issue, because I know I'm sensitive or very disoriented by industrial type sounds, but I love chainsaw work and I love tractor work, not with the chainsaw with head protection I'll always wear, but on a tractor without a cab, I'll normally, even though I should wear it, will forget, just won't put on any ear defence, and after a few hours of working with it on full revs, I'm fine with that, but don't ask me a question in the 5 minutes I've finished work with a chainsaw or a tractor. I'm all over the place. But does anybody else get that type of problem?
Yes, I don't go anywhere near machinery if I can help it. and that is the noise. I really struggle with noise in the environment generally.
Not so much machinery, but kind of like that sensitivity to like temperature change. So if it's too hot, too cold, it's just kind of like trying to regulate your body temperature. Like it's all you can think about is like, I'm too hot, I'm too hot, I'm too hot, rather than what you're doing. So I'd say more kind of a sensory on that side.
I guess less so like sensory, but more, I don't know if it's a thing, but I have a real problem with like keys and taps and hose pipes. You know, the hose pipe connection that goes into the one. It's like such a struggle for me that I actually feel a bit like, oh no, I need to go and turn the tap on. And that feels a bit overwhelming because unlike there's people in the room that I've broke their house keys or car keys, I'm terrible with keys and I don't know if that's a thing, but it's something that does affect me at work. I snapped the tractor key on the first day that I used the tractor. So yeah, don't give me any keys.
I was going to say there's perhaps an overlap there a bit with dyspraxia, and also like fine motor control can be an issue within some neurodivergent conditions. I know that I was diagnosed as dysgraphic when I was a child because I just can't handwrite. Like the fingers won't do the thing at that small scale, fine at larger scale. There are a couple of things I wanted to say on these challenges. One is sort of another term of executive function, which is, you know, that ability to plan tasks and do them in order. You know, the classic one is remembering to take all the tools out to the field with you. Invariably, there's one I've left behind. You know, that is, you know, for me, it's like it needs to be written down. I need to have something, like, clearly I need the time to think it through before rather than just going ahead and doing it. And having a system in place for that. And also time blindness. Like, I have no idea whether I've been sat here for 5 minutes or 5 hours. I have very little concept of time. And that's amazing if, like, you're picking salad for 3 hours. It's just like, oh, I've only been here 5 minutes and I've got buckets full. So I think that can be in the right position. But yeah, I need someone else to be paying attention to time all the time.
I will try and keep this concise to this question, but definitely I feel, I'm aware that it's like, there's a part of me that's like, this isn't selling neurodivergence. There's this, like, I think almost there's a culture of like now, neurodivergence can almost, or neurodiversity. I mean, now I'm hearing this term neurodivergence, I'm going to use that, but I've always been hearing this buzzword of neurodiversity, and it's like, actually a lot of employers are now like, oh, I want to get someone who's neurodiverse, but then there isn't actually the systems in place for them to actually be inclusive, because then you actually have to make some effort, and we'll speak to that in the next question, I'm aware. But so what I was going to say is, like, and it's been touched on already a little bit, but in some of my research, I found this statistic that at least half of all people with ADHD or ADD also have another condition, and that could be anxiety, depression, OCD, like IBS, allergies, chronic fatigue, and I feel that there isn't this conversation happening in Landwork about that. And so considering that the Farmers Weekly is saying that, I can't remember, that there's like soaring statistic of how many people are neurodivergent in Landwork. But then I'm like, how does that work with the fact that maybe quite a lot of them will have some form of fatigue issues? Obviously, like physical labor is tiring anyway, and then there's endless loops of burnout. But I just wonder how much is like masked. Well, the masking that happens when you're neurodivergent and you're masking your symptoms and the fatigue of that in and of itself. But like, I'm just really curious about, what is needed in those systems for people to be able to do what they love without it feeling like impossible for so many bodies, actually. And I know this is a big piece, and I'm just going to speak to it a little bit, but it feels like the elephant in the room is like the wider system that holds us all, which is like systemic capitalism that puts endless pressure on people being machine-like in their productivity. And that kind of, I feel that actually really translates quite harshly in Landwork with this kind of almost Protestant work ethic, which is like, the faster you are, the more stamina you've got, the more consistent stamina you've got, the more strength you've got, the better Landwork you are. There's just no question of it. If you're slower or if you make mistakes, you're inherently not as good at Landwork. It's almost like seems objective. But and then there's also this piece of like, but there's therapeutic gardening for you, and there's an amazing place for that. But the fact that, that would potentially be your only avenue rather than paid work feels really, really messed up to me. And what was one more thing? I just think, I think that kind of, I think something needs to, more conversation needs to happen around the fact that with the kind of monopolization of supermarkets and this like high yield, low wage culture, there's like, it's inherently not conducive to people with different sensory needs, different learning pace and learning style. And because of that, we have to go into a shame mode where we hide those things, we get exhausted, or we exclude ourselves from it. And so that's why I'm just really excited about the next question as well.
Thanks. And that's really brilliant introduction, I think, as to the heart of the matter really in this here is, what do we already see working on farms, and what further changes or adaptations are needed? And how does the farm benefit? Because it's deliberately put positively, because if we've got 1 in 3 farm workers neurodivergent, and actually including many farmers in that as well, by definition, good farms, in many cases, will have already, not necessarily consciously, but be dealing with neurodivergence well, with actually bringing the best out of the neurodivergent. And that everything I've learned was learnt on the job either before I became self-employed and since as well. And somehow the farmers who took me on, like me just asking for a job and then putting me through more training or trusting me with machinery, which some people would have said was an insane thing to do the way at times. But actually managing the way they trained me and the sensitive way they go about it, and they had no idea they were dealing with somebody who's autistic. I couldn't have even explained what autism was at the time. And perhaps quite often it can be the autistic teaching the autistic, giving the rates as there, and probably unconsciously in the past. But I suppose, Karen, you're probably the best qualified to talk at the moment about what farmers do and already are doing.
Yeah, I'd say kind of just naturally already, obviously kind of like practical, quite hands-on work. So I can't talk for everybody, but I know for myself that I learn visually the best. So there's no like verbal instructions, written instructions. I just struggle to process that. Where if someone actually shows me something and I can visually see that, that's the way like I learn best. And I think that happens quite naturally on a lot of farms anyway. So that's obviously something that, say, people do need to be aware of is kind of how they give those instructions and actually talk to the individual and be like, which way, and do you need me to write it down as well as tell you? So that obviously like short-term memory is an issue, especially in ADHD. It's having those lists and those checklists as well. I'd also say another, already working on farms is quite flexible, varied work, which again, my ADHD brain, that really suits. I'd say something that perhaps they could do better, which is a very fine line, is that I don't like to be micromanaged. If someone micromanages me, I'm probably going to quit that job. But I also need some structure and accountability. So I just find I think it's quite difficult for like employers to kind of get that right, to kind of say that motivation of, yeah, because if there's a deadline, like I do work at superhuman speed. Like I managed, one of the reasons I got like my diagnosis, I've got 3 degrees related to food security and agriculture. And it's like, how did I manage that? But it's because it's a special interest. And most of my exams were revised for the night before. And most of my assignments are done in like superhuman speed. Like just have to get enough kind of adrenaline and dopamine to get that done. So I think it's just kind of like, yeah, being on farm, they're kind of keeping that in mind, really, of like reminding people when things need to be done, but also not being too overbearing on it. And I think this day and age as well, we have so much technology. Like one of my superpowers is quite often ignoring notifications on my phone, but it does help. So I had so many systems in place already that I didn't actually know were coping strategies. So like on my Outlook, I have a traffic light system of red for what I haven't done, and then green for when I've done it. And I've always done that. I've tried different apps and calendars, but I just need it, that object permanence of something not existing if it's not in front of you. Like just, it's such a simple way of me working, knowing what I need to do. I literally write everything in my calendar, which is probably a nightmare for my manager when he kind of sees what I'm doing, but it's there in front of me. I remember how to do it. So again, I think it's that making sure that you kind of have like boards on the farm with jobs that need doing and things like irrigation. If it's like irrigation to be done, it's just making sure that you have reminders of when it needs to be done. Again, that time management and that time blindness. It's just externalizing it. So it's that executive function, that planning, that organizing it. It's making sure that it's externalized somewhere that works for the individual, be that kind of a hard copy on an app. But yeah, it's just finding systems that work.
As it's Joe about to say, I was just going to point out that this is actually what a big ask it is of farming to meet the needs of neurodivergence. Joe did a quick poll of neurodivergent land workers. What do you need in a job? And they're total opposites there. So how does a farm manage to accommodate neurodivergence when you're going to provide that on the same place?
Yeah, so I just put out like a quick poll on Instagram. And so, yeah, you can see some people say, I want routine, regular breaks and weekly check-ins about task priorities. And then someone else will say, like, the freedom to structure my day is I'd like so I can focus on jobs and feel motivated to do. So again, it's like what Ren was saying on micromanagement and what level is right. I guess everyone's so nuanced. It has to be about the human that you're working with. And then, yeah, shared passion, again, talking about like special interests. If someone else has that in your team, then you're going to fuel each other's fire. Flexibility, understanding, and autonomy. And I was, just speaking to some of these, like, the best experience I ever had was at a farm in Cumbria called Growing Well, which is a mental well-being charity predominantly, but it's also a huge vegetable organic farm. And they just had the most incredible structures because they're dealing with volunteers and supporting people in that space. Just the regularity of their breaks and their lunch breaks and the time, and there would be a bell that went off. Like, I absolutely loved the structure of that, and that's something that we carry in our work now, is we try to have break at exactly the same time so everyone knows their expectations of when they're going to eat. And yeah, with the calendar, it was so interesting. That's how I manage, that's how, like, my calendar is full even to be like, eat breakfast, cycle to work, because I need to see the next thing coming up. And yeah, it's my massive coping mechanism. I love Google Calendar, but yeah. I was just,
I feel that it's a lot to do with ideally building a culture where we can feel safe enough to share and not fear that we're going to lose our job because we've got needs. And I think there's also something about building a culture of encouragement and appreciation, because being able to hear feedback on what we're doing well can really support, especially if we are more prone to going into those shame spirals, which, like a neurodivergent system is more prone to often. And then I guess, with adjustments, being able to make adjustments, I feel with what I was saying earlier about, for instance, fatigue, looking at this other statistic that I found, which is 50 to 75% of adults. Okay, this is ADHD related only, but it could well be autism as well. 50 to 75% of adults with ADHD have sleeping problems, and that could be falling asleep, staying asleep, or feeling really exhausted during the day, or having insomnia. I just think that fact in and of itself means that maybe having something simple like knowing that if you were having a really tired day, after lunch you could take 5 minutes somewhere quiet to just put your feet up, and for that not to be oh my God, that person can't work here, and I just don't see that in a lot of the farms that I've visited. It's just you want to nap, what are you doing, and so I think it does take challenging the assumed norms of what a farm can look like, and maybe changing the structure a bit, because maybe there is no comfy sofa at that farm, but it's maybe investing in a second-hand comfy sofa or something. And finally, with that, just to finish on, I think it's a really nuanced thing, this whole thing of fatigue, and I learned that from my own personal experience. But when I feel safe and welcome as I am as much as possible, that directly impacts on my nervous system, which is at the core of neurodivergence. And in all of our human experience, the nervous system, that social nervous system, those cues of am I safe, am I welcome, am I safe, is the thing that can make us so tired, because if we're getting going through freeze, flight, fight all the time, rather than just rest and digest, work as we should be, then we're getting tired when we don't need to. So if we do feel safe and welcome enough, then we can have that energy, and we can, thrive really well, maybe with some moments of making some adjustments, but just generally, we can access and tap into so much more energy and wellness if that culture is in place. So, yeah.
So just quickly before we go over to the audience, I think, I just wanted to share something that I think is working for us. I mean, I'm the boss, so I'm probably not the best person to ask if it's working. But once a month, we're only a small team, there's 4 of us, all part-time. But we have a monthly meeting where we get together, and as the person in charge, I intentionally try to set a very open environment where I'm very open about what's going on for me in terms of my emotions, my management of my neurodivergence and my needs. And that has created an environment where, although the people I work with are neurotypical, they're very open about what's going on for them. So they've had a lot of life events that have unsettled them, and so we've been able to negotiate flexible timing that has meant that when they are at work, they're more productive, because they're not trying to come into work at a time when they really can't emotionally. So I think just having that communication, and that is a way of dealing with the fact that we are completely contradictory in what we need, and unless you ask someone, and give them the chance to understand what they need, that's the only way of doing it.
That feels really getting to the nub of the matter. It's about people engaging well. It's about treating people as human beings. And that, we will come back to that. But I wonder if if there are any questions or points from the audience first, or there's one at the back. If you speak loud, got a mic, right?
Hello. So this is for the whole panel. Have you come across or use your own access riders? So this is something that I've only recently come across more in like an arts context. I've never come across it in like a land-based or farming, which is why I was wondering. Basically, it's like a rider that stipulates your access needs. Yeah, a document. Yeah.
I've not come across it. It sounds great. I know that, in particular, like the Arts Council have been amazing on the work they do for disability inclusion. I think we're a world away from that in land work. You know, I've not known there to be, I think we're one of the first discussions of disability in general. You know, and this is about neurodiversity. I've yet to see much of a discussion at all about physical disability in land work. I think we're very far away from that wonderful ideal that we could work towards.
Yeah, my only experience of something like that is I work for a charity called Transition Together, part of the Transition Network, and we have user manuals. So when anyone starts the job, it's a lovely document that asks you what your needs are, what your boundaries are, and how they can support you in your place of work. And that's the closest thing I think I've seen to that.
I say, with the neurodivergent, like ADHD coaching course I've just done, it's obviously 100 people from various industries, and there was a nurse, and she's done that like for the NHS for nurses. So I think obviously like they're just starting doing it. It's something that we say definitely need, but like Richard said, we're not there yet. It's something it definitely needs looking at.
And I think it has to be said that I would say for me, there'd be a huge amount of vulnerability in just like having a really transparent document that if there isn't other people doing that, I actually, at the farm that I help at, I haven't said explicitly I'm neurodivergent. I'm sure in some ways it's clear, but I certainly haven't had that conversation, and I personally wouldn't feel that the culture is there yet too, but I think it would be amazing to get to that point where it could just be like, these are my needs, and like, let's talk about it, yeah.
I just wanted to say there's someone, I think, here from SALT, the landworkers union, who've put together some information about this, but I think we struggle with workers' rights across the board in the land workers sector, so I think this is sort of part of an ongoing discussion about the fact that, yes, like you are putting yourself in a very difficult position if you put your hand up and say, I have needs. There's so few workers' rights.
Could we have one from online and then...
So a question from online, is there any network or group where neurodivergent land workers can connect to continue this incredibly important space? And if there isn't, is this something that the panel will be interested in starting up together?
That will be actually part of the summary of where we go from here, because we're not an organisation, and that's a gap. Yeah. I think.
QR code.
I could.
Oh, say, because we have got like I've got a QR code for people that are interested to like send. It will come through to me details, and then we can take it from there.
To be honest, one thing we're hoping for out of this conversation is, because we're individuals without the resources, to actually run with this, to try and see what we can actually change, whether there's perhaps producing a toolkit for farms so they can get the most out of neurodivergent workers, to both sides benefit, so the farms prosper as well, and resources for neurodivergent land workers. So any organisation that have the inclination to run with it is welcome to scan this QR code, but we'll also be in person moving on to a classroom at the end of this session. If people would like to discuss on that, where we go from here is really important. But back to...
Sorry.
Do any of you know of workplace neurodiversity training that you would recommend? Because I work at a community garden with 9 other people that are mostly neurotypical and older and not necessarily aware of the issues and have a bit more of like a bootstraps mentality around that kind of stuff. And we look after about 70 volunteers. A lot of them are higher needs. And if anything, that's like makes it harder to talk about neurodiversity, because if you're autistic, then you're that kind of autistic or that, yeah. So being someone who's like can pass is like, it's harder to talk about the nuance of the issues that I might experience. So is there any workplace training that you know about, or particularly any that might be alternative or land work based might be helpful?
Something I'd like to do.
I know that the National Autistic Society offer that. I don't know the quality of it. And I can't think which trade union it was, but I know someone else who organised it through their trade union that was in a different sector. But those might be areas to look at.
There's also a new course that's just been designed. I think it's like a collaboration between Harper Adams University and ADHB that say, I've seen it online. It's like through Lantra, I think, which say it's an online thing, but that's like aimed at the rural industries as well. Oh, I'd have to find it. So it's.
Diversity.
Okay, yeah.
And Lantra have been doing research into neurodivergence. Hopefully, they might come up with something deliberately targeted at this.
Okay, hi. Just one sort of comment that I wanted to make is that I have had to explain to employers sometimes what like ASD is, or how it kind of presents, because obviously there's been some very negative ideas about it for a long time, and like a lot of people are becoming aware that there is more going on, and they sometimes kind of ask for a bit more explanation. And just something I wanted to say, I found a useful way of explaining it is, and I think that this is also, from what I understand, reflected in the science about the brain, but I usually say that it's like an unevenness in your skills. So like there are some areas in which you're very adept, and other areas where you're quite like lacking, whereas more neurotypical people tend to have like an evenness of their skills, and also an evenness in the speed of their acquisition of skills. And so I sometimes say that, and also just it helps me remember that just because you haven't acquired a skill at the normal time, like often for people with ASD, that's social skills. Just because you haven't acquired it when most neurotypical people do, that doesn't mean that you never can. Like there is this idea that people with ASD just can never be social and they can never do these certain things. And I've really found that's very limiting. So actually, like if you just give yourself enough time, and you have to do a lot more, maybe effort to pick things up, but it is possible. And that's, so I don't know if the panel has any thoughts or like experience around that kind of thing. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I think sort of picking up on both of those last two things, I think we have really appalling representation in the media of neurodivergent people. Like, you know, back in the day, with Rain Man was like the only autistic representation. Now we've got Sheldon in Big Bang Theory, and it's just like, you know, disability in general is just really poorly portrayed in the media, and neurodivergence in particular. And it's just like, it would be great if we could have some more visible representation, because that's the way that the people that we're working alongside will really understand it. However much we say to them, it's really those narratives and understanding that needs to be developed.
Yeah, he's brilliant.
Yes. Yeah, did a good show, I think too. Yeah, on the skills side, it's quite interesting. I can't remember whose book I was reading, but it said like there's often kind of like a mirroring. So anything that like we struggle with, there's also like a strength. And so for one of those things, I would say for ADHD is impulsivity. So impulsivity is often seen as like a negative thing, but actually some of the best decisions I've ever made in my life and where I've ended up is because I've made some impulsive decision where I've not thought through the future consequence, and it's worked out really well. So I'd say kind of on that skill side, there's always kind of for every negative, there's kind of a positive as well.
It's really young. Oh, sorry, we're online is next.
Oh, thank you.
There's a question from online. How can factors like sensory sensitivities and hyperfocus improve the reconnection to food, community, and the land? That's quite a big question for 5 minutes towards the end, sorry.
Any takers on that one?
I just think it's that kind of that passion and that belief that we can do something, be a big part of it. Just from personal experience, I'm not from a farming background. I financially supported myself through all of my degrees. And it's kind of because I had interest in something and a hyper focus, it's got me to where I am now, which say at the Soil Association, kind of my master's research project was in agroecology, and now we can integrate it more into kind of like mainstream farming. And that's basically the job I do now. So I think just that passion and drive. So again, I think we have a lot of, because of all the like setbacks and criticism that we receive, we're such determined people a lot of the time. We have so much grit, determination, and just even with, that's why we get so burnt out. Like research shows, that's why we get the chronic fatigue, that's why we get the fibromyalgia, because we don't know when not to push ourselves really. Because when we're passionate about something, we just go for it. So I think that's where we're going to make such, say, big changes in the food system, because we're quite relentless when we're passionate about something.
So I just want to say on the sensory sensitivities thing, it just made me think about a couple of things I've heard about people working in school with children around exploring new vegetables and things. And one was a friend who was working growing in a school, and she kind of eventually got all of the kids to try all of the things they were growing. And the thing that really took off was sorrel, because of that really lemony flavour, and it ended up kind of, they would come to her, please miss, am I allowed to have one of the lemon leaves? And another was one on the food programme on Radio 4, was where they were getting kids to taste things that they wouldn't normally taste, and it was okay to not like it. But just to describe it, and one of them was like talking about raw mushrooms as like tasting like cupboards, but even though they didn't like it, they went back to it. So they sort of, I think, just ways of like getting people to explore the range of sensory sensitivities, especially through taste, and mouth texture, in a non-judgmental way, is perhaps a way into getting people to explore foods in a different way.
Hi. Hello? Yes, okay. Just wanted to ask about children. So I'm dyslexic, I've got ADHD, and I've got 2 children, one of whom's got ADHD, and I'm a farmer, and I'm trying to bring my children up in a sort of farm environment. As my older child's like, gets in trouble at school, can't concentrate, all the normal kind of stuff. So how do I, as a parent, or have you got some tips or some ideas about, as a parent, how do I best encourage him into finding his superpowers in the farm, but also helping him to use the farm to kind of regulate himself a little bit better and thrive, basically. So children and farming, basically.
I definitely don't have kids, so I can't speak exactly, but I have worked with kids, and actually I know it's not specifically farming, but it feels relevant to say that alongside doing land work, I'm trained as a forest bathing guide, which is funny because Karen mentioned that. And that's all about kind of these simple embodied sensory activities of connecting in the woods or other places in nature, getting your hands in the mud. And when I've guided walks for young ones, I've definitely noticed kids that have higher needs, often neurodivergent, they can find moments of relaxation and connection with other young people when usually they would be off one-to-one with someone, not able to join the group. And so I think there is, for me, an intersection between land work and farming and that kind of maybe more explicit nature connection piece where you get to just enjoy the senses of like, what does the soil feel like right now, rather than just being like, and this is how you grow the carrot, and that might not be as interesting in that moment, but it's like, how do you make it playful, fun, and regulating for them through the senses? Yeah, that's one piece for me.
We ought to be winding the session up around about now, but what a brilliant point to raise it on, question. It makes me think of a number of neurodivergent friends who are raising their kids and the same issues that they had at school coming up now, and it's something that really would like, we're not actually giving much of an answer here now, but what a question to be focusing on going forward and trying to get some attention from major farming organisations. Look, what advice and help are they going to give in this situation? Sorry we're not being that more helpful now. But I'd like to thank everybody who's participated here and come along. It's really good to see this issue being taken up more. If you'd like to carry on talking about this and seeing if our different minds here can put some ideas for how we go forward from now, we will be about a minute's walk to the Blue Boar. We'll go upstairs room there to continue it. Sorry.
The upstairs room of St Albans is called the Blue Room.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the upstairs room called the Blue Room at St Aldate's. If we sort of potter along together, the people who are going is probably easiest, but that's where we'll be. And if you scan that QR code, when we find out that that's more for people online, or they can come back and scan it from on computer.
And I just wanted to say thank you, Jim. Thank you for chairing. Thank you for organising and bringing this conversation.
That's it, I suppose, then, for today. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.